What are HSAs? Should you be using one? And if so, should you be investing the money that's inside of it? Let's get into it. I'm excited because today is the first of our listener questions that I've received. I got an email from somebody who had seen my explainer video talking about how investment accounts work. She hadn't realized that she could invest the money that was inside of her HSA. So she sent me this email asking if she should be doing that. Here's what she said. I had no idea our HSA was a bucket holding money that could be invested. I just thought the only benefit was that it was pre-tax money. And she asked if there's anything she should know before her enrollment process for her HSA. She said, the amount we have in there is more than enough for our regular medical expenses, but could easily be used up if somebody were to break a bone. Ask me how I know. I'm curious what investing would do to the availability of funds in the event of a larger need like that, which is an excellent question. So let's get into it. So first of all, for those of you who don't know, let's talk about what an HSA is. It is short for a health savings account. This is an account that is used to give you tax incentives for saving for healthcare expenses. Now, you should know it's only available if you have a high deductible healthcare plan, which is something we're going to talk about here in a second. But if you have access to an HSA, here's how it works. You can contribute money up to a certain maximum contribution limit, and the money that you contribute gives you a tax deduction in the year that you contribute it. So whatever amount you contribute, say it's $5,000, it will reduce your taxable income for that year by $5,000. So you get a tax benefit right away. But it's even better than that because you also get a tax benefit when you make withdrawals from the account as long as it's used for qualified medical expenses. So you get a tax deduction when you make the contribution. You can also withdraw the money tax-free. What that means is that if the money in the account has grown, that growth is all tax-free. That means that the HSA actually has some of the best tax benefits in all of the investing world. It's better than a Roth IRA because the Roth IRA gives you the tax-free growth, but you don't get a tax benefit at the beginning. And it's better than a traditional IRA because a traditional IRA, you get the tax benefit at the beginning, but not the tax-free withdrawals at the end. So it's kind of like you take the tax benefits of both a traditional IRA and a Roth IRA, and you get both of them, which is unheard of. So what's the problem? Well, there are a couple of things you need to be aware of before diving into this. First of all, like I said, you can only use an HSA if you're using a high deductible healthcare plan. What does that mean? Well, a traditional healthcare plan, you have a deductible that you have to meet before the health insurance starts paying for any sort of non-preventative healthcare, right? So with a traditional healthcare plan, you're paying your monthly premiums, but if something happens, like you break a bone or you get in a car accident, there's going to be a certain dollar amount that you have to pay out of pocket first before the insurance kicks in for the rest. And with a normal, traditional healthcare plan, it might be $2,000 or $3,000. So let me find out actually. So for a traditional healthcare plan, that deductible amount is somewhere around $1,600 to $1,800 on average, but it can vary quite a bit depending on your specific insurance, right? But a high deductible healthcare plan just takes that deductible amount and increases it by quite a bit. So instead of $1,800, it might be $12,000 for your family. So some much higher amount for that deductible. The trade-off is that those high deductible plans cost a lot less. Your monthly premiums are lower. And that's because by having a higher deductible, you are taking some of the risk back from the insurance company and taking it on yourself. And so a high deductible plan will have lower monthly premiums, higher deductible, obviously, right? But it also means that you get access to a health savings account or an HSA. And so you have that ability to get that double tax benefit of money that's used for healthcare expenses. But that is the first thing we should talk about is a high deductible healthcare plan the right choice for you and for your family? Because I think there are two kind of factors that really weigh into that decision. One is your health or your family's health. If you have any sort of chronic, illness or things that you're going to need surgery for or, rehabilitation, anything like that, where it's going to be expected ongoing medical expenses, you might be better off with a traditional healthcare plan because you won't have to spend that whole amount on your deductible every year before the insurance starts kicking in. If you know that it's normal for your family to have $10,000 of medical expenses every year because of some chronic issue, then having a high deductible plan means that you're going to have to pay that out of pocket most likely, or at least the vast majority of it. But if you get a traditional healthcare plan where the deductible is maybe $2,000, then that means that you just pay that $2,000 and then the insurance will cover the rest. So if you know that you're a family that has high healthcare costs on average, you might want to avoid the high deductible healthcare plan altogether, or at least do the math on how it'll work out for you. But even if you're a family that has lower healthcare costs on average, if you're young and healthy and you don't have any current recurring health issues, and you don't expect to use a lot of medical resources, there's another thing to keep in mind, which is your financial situation. With a high deductible healthcare plan, it does mean that, like I said, you're taking on more of that risk yourself. And so if you do have a situation where you get in a car accident, it means that you need to have the cash on hand to cover up to that deductible, right? So you're taking on more of that financial risk onto your own shoulders. So a high deductible healthcare plan works pretty well for people who are young and healthy and don't have a lot of recurring medical expenses and who have enough cash built up in an emergency fund, say, to cover medical expenses. It's up to you and your family to decide which one of those makes more sense. Do you push the risk off to the insurance company, or do you retain the risk in exchange for lower healthcare premiums every month? But in this case, the person who wrote had already made that decision. They already have a high deductible healthcare plan because they already have an HSA. So at that point, the question becomes, should you invest the money that's in the HSA or should you keep it in cash? And once again, that comes down to a question of the state of your overall finances. I know there are a lot of personal finance kind of gurus on the internet who are super excited about HSAs and the tax benefits they provide. So they just give people blanket advice to max out your HSA, invest all of it aggressively, and maximize those tax benefits. And from just a math standpoint, I get why they're doing that. But personal finance isn't all about math, right? You have to remember that the reason you have health insurance and that you're saving for healthcare expenses is to protect your family. So I think the most important thing to keep in mind through this whole process is what will do the best job of protecting your family. And what it comes down to is the emergency fund, the cash that you have on hand. Because let's look at it this way. Let's say that you have a car accident and you have to pay the maximum out-of-pocket amount so that your health insurance will cover the rest. Well, if you have all of that money in your HSA invested, that means you have to sell the investments to cover that expense. So when we're thinking about investments, we often talk about the concept of, your risk tolerance, but also your time horizon. And the reason we worry about the time horizon is that, markets go up and down all the time. It's not uncommon for there to be, pretty big crashes in the market. The market has always eventually recovered, but it takes some time, right? And so the reason we worry about time horizon is that we just want to make sure that you're not forced to withdraw money from your investments in the middle of a market crash. The best protection you have against market crashes is the ability to wait it out and wait for that recovery. Your patience is like a superpower there, right? The problem with investing in an HSA is that you don't know when medical emergencies are going to come up. You don't know when there's going to be a car crash or a trip and fall and a broken bone that you have to pay for. And so if you don't have a cash emergency fund outside of the HSA that can cover that, it means you might be forced to sell things in your HSA no matter what the market's doing, even if the market has crashed recently. You might get back 60% of the money that you put into it because you had to sell at the wrong time. That's exactly what you want to avoid. You want to have enough cash on hand so that you're actually paying those healthcare expenses from your emergency fund out of pocket instead of touching the HSA. You want the HSA to be able to grow uninterrupted for decades, right? So really, if you're thinking about investing the HSA, the best way for it to work is if you kind of separate those two things. You want to stop looking at the HSA as the account you use to pay for your health costs today and start looking at it as this is just tax advantaged long-term investment. You actually use the emergency fund to pay for your day-to-day healthcare costs. And then you just keep the receipts so that later you can reimburse yourself from the HSA long after your investments have grown. And that way you can benefit from all that tax-free growth. I know some people avoid using their HSA in this way for long-term investments just because it adds a layer of complexity that you have to keep track of receipts and reimburse yourself in the future. I hope that you don't get discouraged from using it this way just because of that. The complexity is really not that bad. There are people who just take photos of all their healthcare receipts and put them in a Google document or in a folder. And then 30 years from now, when they want to take money out of their HSA, they might have $20,000 or $30,000 of healthcare costs that they can just use to harvest all that tax-free growth. It's worth the added complexity. So, should you use an HSA? Yes, if you're okay with the risk of a high deductible healthcare plan. If you are in a health situation and financial situation where you can bear that additional risk and use it to lower your monthly premiums on your health insurance, then yes, definitely contribute to the HSA because the tax benefits are incredible. Even if you keep the money in your HSA in cash and actually pay for those health expenses as they arise, you're still getting that tax deduction for putting the money in there in the first place, which is better than just completely paying for it out of pocket. But if you have the financial stability to have an emergency fund that can handle your highest deductibles and your out-of-pocket maximums, and you can handle those shocks to your financial system when healthcare emergencies do come up, then you can consider investing the money in your HSA and letting it grow and using that as a tool for getting those massive tax benefits for your investments. But you have to look at your financial system as a whole. Don't just focus just on the tax benefits. You have to look at your overall picture of, are you able to handle the risks associated with your healthcare? One thing to keep in mind is that I've been talking about your HSA as if the only option is to either have it in cash or to put it all 100% in risky investments, like 100% in stocks. And that's not the way it has to be. You can take your HSA and divide it up into a more diversified portfolio, right? So let's say that your out-of-pocket maximum for your healthcare expenses is $15,000. And your emergency fund right now is only $12,000. So if the worst case scenario happened and you had to completely max out your out-of-pocket maximum, you'd have a $3,000 shortfall, right? If you knew that, you could look at your HSA and keep $3,000 in cash inside the HSA just in case. And then you could invest any money past that. Or, some people might have, 50% of their HSA in a stock fund, but then 50% of it divided between a bond fund and cash. So it's in more defensive assets, right? So that way, if something were to happen, you could sell just from the bond fund and withdraw from the bond fund and the cash and not touch the stocks if the market is down. There are things you can do like that to be able to have access to some of the funds and make sure that they're there for you when you need it without completely giving up growth in the account. But I will say this, the people who are really trying to optimize for these tax benefits, they will try to make the portfolio in the HSA as aggressive as possible, because the more the account can grow, the better those tax benefits are for you. You get a tax deduction for making the contribution either way, but if it only grows 50%, that's only this much of a tax benefit you get for that growth. Whereas if it can grow 200% and that's all still tax-free, then you're maximizing those tax benefits as much as you can, right? So a lot of people will try to make the HSA as aggressive as they can make it to maximize those benefits. But what that means is that you have to be prepared to cover any healthcare expenses outside of the HSA because you don't want to have to touch this when there's a market downturn. The other thing I will say is that, on paper, if you just look at the math, the HSA is going to be better than a Roth IRA or a traditional IRA. And so on paper, you should prioritize maxing out the HSA and putting as much money into that as you possibly can. And look, that's not a bad idea, but I think there is something to be said for also prioritizing flexibility, right? You don't want to only be able to withdraw your funds without a penalty if it's for medical expenses. If you end up not having any major medical expenses for the next 30 years, you might end up with a big chunk of money in that account that you don't really feel like you can touch, right? And so I think it's definitely a good idea to contribute to it, but even though the tax benefits aren't as strong, I would also put money into something like, a Roth IRA where you can always withdraw your original contributions without any penalties. And even like a taxable brokerage account, because even though you don't get those tax benefits, you get a lot more flexibility. And so I think there is something to be said for prioritizing a flexible financial plan that can move with you and be there for you when you need it without a lot of restrictions. You have to balance that with the tax benefits, right? And it's up to you whether you're trying to prioritize tax benefits or flexibility or security in your financial plan. But hopefully this has given you enough information that you can kind of see the clear trade-offs and when you would want to prioritize each of those. Hopefully that gives you some clarity about when you'd want to use an HSA and how you might fit it into your financial plan. But in the meantime, thank you for being here. And if you do have any money questions, please send them to the email address in the description. I appreciate you all spending some time with me today and hope you have a great day. Thanks for watching.